The following is a local resident producer's program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of CATV2, Oshkosh Community Media Services, the City of Oshkosh, or Time Warner Cable.
Hello, and welcome to Oshkosh Diaries. I'm Paul Esslinger. In the introduction to the show, we said that the show was going to be about influential people that helped shape Oshkosh. And today we're going to talk about a significant person, probably, arguably, the most significant person in Oshkosh, and that would be Chief Oshkosh. And to help us out today, we're going to talk to a Chief Oshkosh expert, a person who wrote the book, a biography on Chief Oshkosh called Like a Deer Chased by the Dogs, The Life of Chief Oshkosh. His name is Scott Cross. Mr. Cross is an archivist at the Oshkosh Public Museum. So without any further ado, Mr. Cross, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. What compelled you, first of all, to write the book?
Well, I came to Oshkosh as the archivist for the Public Museum about 14 years ago. And part of my job position is, and my duties, is to do information requests. And recently I do anywhere in the number of 600 requests per year. And one of the most common requests that I would always get is, what can you tell me about Chief Oshkosh? Because there was very little published information. So I began looking through our information files, newspaper clippings from the past, things of that nature. And the more I looked at the things that we did have, I realized that there was probably enough for at least a little pamphlet or something that we could give to people. And as I got more and more information, I realized that there's probably enough for a small book if I continued doing research. So I went through the State Historical Society's books and interviews that were done at the time that Chief Oshkosh was alive. Looked at the treaty documents and things of that nature, and then took a look at our collection to see what artifacts that we had. And by the time I was finished with the research, there was enough for a small book.
Okay. Well, we got a bunch of questions. Before you ask your question, you said there was a bunch of questions asked about him. What was the most common question asked about Chief Oshkosh?
Well, they were different. What can you tell me about his life? Where was he born? Where did he die? Some of the questions concerned his burial at Menominee Park, whether that's actually him that's actually buried on that spot. And it was just a lot of different general questions, but those were the most popular.
Okay.
And how long did it take to write this book from start to finish?
I would say, since I do have other duties at work, it got a little...
Of course.
It got a little protracted. It probably took about a year. And then our graphics department at the museum put everything together. I selected the objects. We had a photographer who photographed the objects and then borrowed a few images from the State Historical Society. So probably about a year.
What struggles or obstacles did you have?
Probably the biggest obstacle I had was that there are very, very few written accounts about Chief Oshkosh. And I really, really had to dig. I was very fortunate to find two accounts. One was by an artist by the name of Paul Kane, who came down through Canada through this region. And he actually did a sketch of Chief Oshkosh, which is in an art museum in Texas now. But he made some wonderful observations. He spent some time with the tribe, spoke with Chief Oshkosh, watched and observed him, and provided a really good account. Another account I found was published in a book of an Englishman who came to the United States and traveled through the Midwest and further west. And he too visited the Menominee tribe and spent some time with Oshkosh. And so those were two real gems, but it was very difficult to find anything else. It hadn't been written much, much later. People's recollections, and sometimes children, or it was folklore handed down from generation to generation. So
one of the things, Scott, as a 48-year lifelong member of Oshkosh, One of the things I always heard about is that Oshkosh was not actually spelled Oshkosh. Is that fact or fiction? And discuss that if you could.
That is correct. His name was originally pronounced Oshkosh without an H in there. If you look at all the early treaties, it clearly is spelled O-S, an apostrophe, and then Kosh. And it wasn't until there was a clerical error that it became Oshkosh. And it's when the city of Oshkosh was being incorporated, they sent all the proper legal documents to Madison, and a clerical error occurred. And instead of Oshkosh, it was spelled Oshkosh.
Did they take the hyphen as an H or something?
They took that out, and that's where the H went. And so legally, it was now the city of Oshkosh.
So did he end up spelling his name that way then? Or?
Well, he did not read or write in
Okay.
English, so usually he just made a mark on treaties, and then whoever was sitting there would try to take the Menominee pronunciation and translate that into English.
Was there anything that citizens or the tribe wrote with the name Oshkosh?
Not that I've found. So
Okay. What year was the city named, and why was it named after Oshkosh? How did that come to be?
well, you actually have to go back a little further. When Winnebago County was established, it was very rural. There was a few fur trading posts. Where the city of Oshkosh now, there was just a few farms. But enough people had come to this area that they needed a post office. And a post office at that time was run by a postmaster, probably right out of his log cabin. And the local men got together from the county and were going to vote on what they wanted to name the post office. And the Yankees that had come from New England and Pennsylvania, they all had different names. Athens was one of them. And then there was a contingent from the Butimore area, including the Grigno family and others. And they wanted to name the area after Chief Oshkosh, due to the fact that where the city of Oshkosh eventually came and where the post office was going to be was Menominee land. And that Oshkosh had signed the treaty ceding that over to the federal government and allowing whites to actually purchase that land. And so there was a vote. Since the Yankees were split on it, the local French fur traders and their assistants won, and it became Oshkosh.
What were the other choices?
The only other one I can remember off the top of my head is Athens. But I think one of them wanted to name it Wrightsville after the Wright family, who were some of the first settlers here.
Okay. All right.
Did he visit much with the citizens of Oshkosh? And if he did, what was their general perception of him?
Oshkosh, it's a bit of a misnomer or a misunderstanding. Oshkosh did not live on what is now the city of Oshkosh. It was tribal land, but once the city was established, he was a frequent visitor. The reservation is relatively close, so he probably spent more time in Green Bay. And whenever he visited the city, it usually made the newspapers, and people would remark on his tall black hat and his tailcoat that he would wear,
Sure.
and then also wearing his leather breeches and other.
How often was he seen in the area?
Not infrequently. I don't have enough exact numbers on how often he did visit, but it was enough that people recognized him, they knew who he was, and if he did come to town, it was usually a big deal.
Okay. One of the things that I collect from Oshkosh are brewery items. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Oshkosh Brewing Company took their logo from Chief Oshkosh with the hat. And collecting brewery items, you hear so many different things that he didn't want his picture taken, he wanted his picture taken. He didn't get any royalties from that. Can you explain, first of all, how that came to be that the Oshkosh Brewing Company had his likeness for their logo, and what all went into that?
I really haven't done much research to the Oshkosh Brewery and why they chose Chief Oshkosh. You probably know more about that than I do. But as far as the photograph was concerned, yeah, there's a lot of different accounts of it was on the 50th anniversary. There was interviews with old settlers here in Oshkosh, and one of the topics discussed was when Chief Oshkosh had his daguerreotype or photograph taken here in Oshkosh. And stories ranged that he was intoxicated and a bunch of local drunks took him into a photographer's studio. Another one that he had agreed to do it and someone just grabbed a top hat and stuck it on his head for the image. And there's just all kinds of stories, and none of them are really true.
So, is it daguerreotype? Why don't you explain what that is? Is that essentially
Sure.
what a picture is now?
A daguerreotype was the first successful photographic process. Basically, it's just a copper plate that's been coated with silver. And then while it's still wet, a chemical mixture is poured onto it that makes it photosensitive. And so it's exposed through a camera, and then another chemical treatment fixes it and stops it from developing, and then you have an image on there. And it was called the mirror with a memory, because you're looking at a piece of silver, but it's got photographic emulsion on it. And if you look at it straight on, it's actually a negative. It's a one-of-a-kind image. But if you tilt it just slightly, you can see then a person's face or a scene. And that was the first successful photographic process.
Okay. So you don't know then, and I never really found out as far as a brewery collector if there was any problem with royalties or if he had to sign anything. I've never heard, to be honest with you.
He'd long since passed away by the time they started using the Chief Oshkosh logo.
And the family didn't.
No, actually, I think they took a great deal of pride, that their ancestor was used. Oshkosh Truck used it for a while.
Oh, they did?
Yes, and several other companies had used it, and the city of Oshkosh used it on their letterheads for a while. So I don't think there was any kind of a problem that way.
Okay, all right.
You mentioned how citizens of this community would react when he would come to town to visit. What could you tell me and us about members of his own tribe and maybe other tribes and what their perception and image of him was?
Sure, yeah. Well, Menominee politics then is much like modern politics today. He was the leader of the Menominee tribe. He was the head chief. However, when he was made head chief, it was a bit of a controversy because the federal government decided we don't want to negotiate with 10 or 20 chiefs. You've got to pick at least one person, one of your chiefs, to be the head chief that we can negotiate with and talk to. There still would be negotiations, but they wanted someone to lead. The head chief of the Menominee had died sometime prior to that, and it was Chief Oshkosh's grandfather, the old king. And no one had stepped up to replace him. So as they were negotiating, there were two main candidates, Caron, who was the son of Chief Toma, who was a war chief with the Menominee. The city of Toma was named after him, and Oshkosh. And finally, no decision could be made. The negotiators finally said, okay, Oshkosh is pure blood Menominee. Caron has part French blood. Oshkosh would be the best representative. We're going to designate him as the head chief of the Menominee. And that created some hostilities between factions. So you've got the losers, you've got the winners, and there was divisions within the tribe, and always would be, through history. And so some of the counts from Menominees that have come down through folklore and oral tradition, it depends on who you're descended from. Some think he was the greatest, chief that the Menominee had. Others took a look at him and said, oh, he sold us out. Look at all the land that he signed away in treaties. So it was divided, but the majority, I would say, really look up to Oshkosh.
And what's known about his family, such as wives, children? How much is known about that?
Not a lot, because unfortunately the federal government really didn't take good records of tribal numbers, except for when it came to paying annuities, and you had to prove that you were a member of the tribe. The only person that's mentioned as far as his ancestor is the old king, and that was his grandfather. Nothing is known or recorded about who his father was, but it's assumed that he died at a younger age. Oshkosh is known to have had at least 3 wives, He had quite a few children. One of the accounts, he's talking about mourning the death of a son. 3 known sons survived, and 1 daughter survived that are known and recorded. So there probably were others. He may have even had other wives too and other children.
So what would be a closest relation today?
Actually, after the book was published, it was during the city's sesquicentennial, and the city did a lot of programs at the Grand Opera House. And when I gave a lecture on Chief Oshkosh there afterwards, I had at least 3 descendants of Chief Oshkosh who had come down from Green Bay or the reservation to hear the presentation, and they introduced themselves to me. And so I've done a little bit of research, and he had, from his other children, or his grandchildren, Ernest and Reginald, there was quite a few children. Those children had children, and quite a few of them are still living in the state today.
Okay. I want to go back to, we were talking about the land sales from the Indians to the whites. What they usually want in larger parcels. Where the property that the city of Oshkosh is on now, what did that encompass, and do you know the dollar amount that was, what it was sold for?
I'll have to check my notes.
Because you always hear that the Indians sold their property, their land for pennies on a dollar, and that they regretted it, years afterward. So I don't know if at that time they thought, if his tribe thought it was a reasonable price, or if he had the power to just do this on his own, and what his tribe would have thought of the price that he achieved for it.
Well, what they did is that they would set up a lifetime annuity. So in many cases, it wasn't just a one cash deal. What they would do is that they would pay each member of the tribe for the land that was ceded to the federal government. In the case where the city of Oshkosh is and the surrounding area, it totaled almost 4 million acres. So we're talking about a really substantial parcel of land. And it's once that was transferred, once the tribe signed the treaty.
This was Menominee, right?
This is the Menominee, right. Then that land was opened up to federal sale. And that's when somebody who worked up at the mill on the Menominee Reservation by the name of Webster Stanley made it as fast as he could down to where Oshkosh is now, and the files or claims started coming in after that. So.
Okay. So what was the total annuity? Did you know what the total annuity would have been?
I don't know what the total annuity was.
Okay. In his relation with his own tribe and the settlers here, the whites, do you think that his activities in his life helped relations, hurt, or had no impact?
I would say it really helped relationships with whites in this area, very much so. The Menominee tribe was the smallest Native American tribe in the state of Wisconsin. Oshkosh had actually, as a young man, fought against the Americans during the War of 1812. But when he realized and saw, especially after he became head chief, just how powerful the American government was, he realized that the Menominee people just could not fight physically against the whites. But he would do his best to negotiate for the best possible deal through these treaties. And he then also supported the United States. During the brief Winnebago War, he formed a company of Menominee warriors that actually marched with U.S. troops down to Fort Winnebago, which is where Portage is now. During the Black Hawk War, they had always had problems, the Menominee, with the Sauk and Fox tribes. And since Black Hawk was leading those tribes, in a rebellion against the U.S. government and had come into Wisconsin, Oshkosh and the other Menominee formed 120 men to volunteer and enlist, and actually did fight towards the end of that war. And things of that nature, showing support for the federal government at time of war, even if it was against other Native American tribes, I think endeared him to local people who still had a real fear, that there might be an Indian revolt and an Indian war might happen. And so that was still a real possibility in their minds.
So when he arrived in Oshkosh on whatever festivity or occasion that he came, he didn't have any fear of coming into town, or I mean, I don't know what the relationship with the whites and the Indians at that time was. So, was he regarded as, from the whites' perspective, as a hero because the city was named after him, and was he celebrated when he came into town?
Very much so. He had stood with the federal government. The city had been named after him. He was also a very eloquent speaker. He would have to speak through an interpreter. But he even, when the tribe was being threatened with removal to Minnesota, and he was negotiating with the federal government as a last-ditch effort, he and other tribal chieftains with an interpreter went to Washington, D.C. and spoke to Millard Fillmore. And Millard Fillmore was so touched that he gave him another 2 years, and then eventually another treaty was signed that allowed the Menominee to stay here in Wisconsin. But part of that influence is that the people of Wisconsin wanted the Menominee to stay here. They did not want to see them cruelly removed, to another place. And editorials are written in the newspaper by whites saying, this is a travesty, the federal government shouldn't be doing this, and possibly even petitioned Washington themselves, because it was a large group that did go and talk to President Fillmore. So there was definitely a lot of respect and love, for Chief Oshkosh.
Okay.
One of the more maybe darker chapters that's known about Chief Oshkosh would be his murder trial, when he was on trial for murder. What could you explain about that? Maybe some background and details?
Yes, that made all the newspapers in Wisconsin, what few of them there were at that time, because Wisconsin was still a territory. The judge that presided was Justice Doty of Wisconsin, who is very well known in Wisconsin history. But the story is that an Ottawa Indian, who was probably a slave, since the Ottawa are not native to this area, was out hunting. And as he thought he was shooting at a deer or some other game, discovered that he had actually shot a Menominee. So he took the body in a boat, went to what is now Green Bay, because on the other side of the river is where a large Menominee village was, and told the story to Chief Oshkosh. As soon as he saw what had happened, he pulled a knife from its sheath and stabbed this gentleman to death. He was arrested, brought on trial. The jury was made up completely of whites. There was no Native Americans. And the case was presented that he had, murdered in cold blood this man. Chief Oshkosh protested and said that in Menominee law, it's basically a life for a life. He had taken a life of one of our tribe members. Now, whether the factor that he was a slave might have come into that also, he may have had less rights, and he said that he was perfectly justified in doing that. Well, the jury deliberated and came back to Judge Doty and said, well, if he had planned this out, then indeed it is a murder. But if he did this at the spur of the moment, then the worst it can be is manslaughter, and basically left the decision to the judge. And the judge made rather a landmark decision. He decided that Menominee tribal law and customs were still in effect, that they were not subject to the laws of the white men in that extent. If they were doing what was required by them from their customs and law, then that was all right, and he dismissed the case.
And what was the public reaction to that at the time?
I have not come across any public reaction. I know afterwards there were some reactions because, as I'd mentioned earlier, there were different factions within the tribe, and particularly those that had some perhaps distant relationship to the slain man. And some of them told a story that Chief Oshkosh was entirely inebriated and flew into the man in a drunken fury. So there were some negative reactions too.
First of all, how did the tribe, the Menominee tribe, feel about one of their own being arrested? I don't know who would have arrested him to begin with, and hauling him down essentially, and putting him on trial if they thought this is a tribal action. Was there any friction with that?
Not that I've ever come across. I think it was motivated by members of the dead man's family, some of whom who were of a mixed blood, predominantly white with some Native American blood in them. And they were the ones who instigated the arrest. And of course, they were extremely displeased with the verdict.
So essentially, during this whole fiasco, would it be fair to say he had few detractors for the trial?
Well, I think it's interesting that a complete jury of nothing but white men, came back and said, well, it's kind of either or.
Well, was there any influence from the city fathers? I mean, that their namesake was being put on trial for murder, and was there any political influence?
This actually predates the.
This predated. Okay.
Yeah, this predates the city of Oshkosh. So.
Okay. One of the other things that Oshkosh residents talk about all the time is Chief Oshkosh buried in Menominee Park? And I know
Yes.
you wrote about this in the book. Yeah. And first of all, answer the question yes or no, and give us the whole spiel on the controversy.
Well, the answer is I don't know. And I did look into it extensively. It had always been assumed that back in 1926, when Macomb made a financial arrangement with Reginald Oshkosh, Chief Oshkosh's grandson, and gave them, the tribe, an undisclosed amount of cash, that they would move the body and rebury it in Oshkosh in memory of him. And so Reginald Oshkosh walked to the cemetery there in Kashina, pointed out the spot where Chief Oshkosh was supposed to be buried. They did an excavation there. Actually, members of the museum, we had an archaeologist on staff at that time, conducted most of the archaeology there. And they discovered 2 skeletons, one male and one female. Mm-hmm. Well, the male skeleton was exhumed. A beautiful white casket was made. There was this wonderful parade through Oshkosh. Members of the tribe came, and a solemn ceremony was held in Menominee Park, and he was buried there. So the story goes. Well, then, back in the 1970s, a Shawano newspaper came out and said that stories were floating around on the Menominee Reservation, that it was common knowledge that Reginald had pointed out an unidentified person, and that's who they exhumed, and that's who they made the trade with. And then again, about 15 years ago, the spokesperson for the Stockbridge-Munsee tribe said that, yes, that's not Chief Oshkosh. He said it's just common knowledge here on the 2 reservations that they took the wrong person. Mm-hmm. And as I was doing my research on it, several of the artifacts that were found in the grave were deposited with the Oshkosh Public Museum. Some of those things were casket parts, something that may have been a daguerreotype that had disintegrated. There were some beads. But along with the skeleton, a finger bone and 2 vertebrae were deposited with the museum.
Oh, okay.
So in discussions with other people around town, once they find that out, it's like, wow, can't we do DNA? Well, no, we can't.
Okay.
The Native American Graves Repatriation Act
will not allow that.
Not only allows that, we no longer have it.
Oh.
Everything that we had that came out of Chief Oshkosh's grave is considered sacred to the tribe, and so everything we had, we contacted the tribe, told them what we have, and then they told us what they wanted back. And of course, anything from Chief Oshkosh's grave was returned to them.
Okay. Well, Scott, we're about halfway through the show, so why don't you take a deep breath? And we've got a couple PSAs we'd like to show. And when we come back, we're going to ask you how Chief Oshkosh passed away.
Sure.
We'll be right back.
But inches beneath the surface, utility lines are carrying electricity, gas, and more to your home. Digger's Hotline helps avoid costly or dangerous mistakes. It doesn't matter how deep you're digging, Call 811 or click diggershotline.com 3 working days before you start your project, and we'll help take the risk out of digging. Protect your simple pleasures. Know what's below.
There is a place where history is captured in time, where the voices of past generations still discuss the days of success, of love, hope, and joy. Timeless, playful,
Welcome to my attic.
memorable. The Oshkosh Public Museum. Come for the sights, stay for the memories.
Hello and welcome back. Derek and I are talking with Scott Cross. He's an archivist at the Oshkosh Public Museum. We're speaking about Chief Oshkosh today, the life and times of Chief Oshkosh. Derek and I have a few more questions we'd like to ask Mr. Cross. We've got some pictures that we'd like to show you and have Scott comment on the pictures. And then maybe if we have some time, Scott, we can talk about some of the activities that are going on at the museum. So, Derek, you're up.
Kind of piggybacking on to what we discussed before the break, how did Chief Oshkosh pass away? How did that come about? Age, causes that were known?
Well, the causes were pretty definite. There's an article in the Shawano newspaper, and it describes in some detail what had occurred. According to the newspaper, Oshkosh had obtained some whiskey, and it was a known fact that Oshkosh was what could be termed today a mean drunk, and he would get into fights and get into brawls. And he had been drinking with 2 of his sons, which 2, we're not sure, they're not named, and that he became very belligerent and physically violent, and they decided they'd just tie him up to a tree and beat him until he calmed down. Well, 2 days later, he had died from the injuries he sustained. There was a very elaborate funeral. It does mention the fact that he was buried in a casket, so the reporter from the newspaper actually stood there, went through the receiving line, and described a casket with a glass plate over the face for viewing, and that casket was inside yet another casket. And then it said that the body was taken out to the cemetery there, and a ceremony was held, and then everybody just filtered and walked away. And the irony is that his oldest son, who was probably one of the participants, then became the head chief of the Menominee until he got into a brawl with a white man and stabbed him and was sent to prison in Waupun. And
Wasn't as lucky.
No, and he was not. He was dethroned, I guess you could say, as head chief, and his younger brother took over.
So what year did he pass away then?
Chief Oshkosh died in 1858.
1858.
Correct.
And the city was formed in 1853, correct?
1853,
Right,
correct.
okay.
Yes.
So essentially he's beaten to death by one or more of his sons.
Unfortunately, yes.
Well, I hope my son isn't watching this show. So okay, again, I mean, I guess just to expand on that, what was the tribe's reaction? What was the other members of the family? I mean, were there any ramifications of that?
Well, unfortunately, there's really no written record. The only account is that newspaper article. It said that there was a great deal of mourning at the reception in the cemetery also, and obviously people who were affected, members of the tribe. And some of the editorials, the Oshkosh newspaper picked that story up and printed it also. And all the bylines said, a great man and a great leader of the Menominee Nation has passed away.
And I don't remember if you mentioned it. Where did this happen?
This happened on the reservation
On the
itself.
reservation.
Yes.
Okay. One thing I guess living in today's age of news, where nobody can do anything without it being news, if you're a newsworthy person, obviously things were much different back then. But I just I find it hard to believe that a man who's a tribal leader. A city is named after him, yet it seems you struggled to find information. I mean, was that common about other people?
Very little. It depends. You know, you have to also take into consideration that communication with the reservation would have been very primitive. You know, at that time in 1858, there's no trains going into the reservation at all. All transportation would have been by coach or horseback. So by the time anyone, say, here in Oshkosh had even heard the story, or the Shawano paper had shown up in Oshkosh, Chief Oshkosh had long been dead and buried by probably a week or two. So news traveled very, very slowly.
Okay. Scott, I want to talk a little bit about some of the activities that you wrote in the book, and I'm just going to mention some of them here. The War of 1812, Treaty of 1827, Council of 1830, Black Hawk War, Cedar Point Treaty of 1836, annual payment at Lake Poygan, 1842. There's a lot of activities there. Was Chief Oshkosh more of a political juggernaut? Was he, was he a tribal leader, or was he both?
Oh, he was definitely a tribal leader. You know, he did lead all the treaty discussions. You know, everybody could speak. It was the tribal leaders and chiefs and elders. It was very democratic. Everybody got to speak. And then there had to be a consensus. And frequently during some of these treaty negotiations, when the majority of the Menominee leaders were willing to sign the treaty, Oshkosh was not willing to sign the treaty. And several of the treaties with the Menominee Nation, his name isn't there. He refused to sign it. And probably the most devastating treaty that he did sign, and that's an interesting story in itself, is when the Menominee tribe were being asked to remove to Minnesota. The negotiations were going very long. It was getting very hot, very furious, the discussion back and forth. Chief Oshkosh was very adamant that they were not going to leave their tribal lands. They were staying here in Wisconsin. The leader for the federal government became so disgusted he jumped on his horse and left. The person who took his place then mentioned to the clerk who was recording everything, he said, if the Menominee do not sign a treaty tomorrow, we will forcibly remove them, with U.S. troops. The gentleman who was a clerk and interpreter was a member of the Porlier family, which had very close ties to the Menominee and Chief Oshkosh. And this young man pulled Chief Oshkosh aside and told him what was going to happen. And after giving it some thought, he decided, well, maybe we can do something else. So they signed the treaty, basically because they were afraid that federal troops were going to come in and push them off.
So it's better to get something than nothing.
Something better than nothing.
Yeah.
But he was very savvy. He was really a negotiator with the federal government. It was very sly, I would say, almost. Because one of the provisions of the treaty in 1848 is that the Menominee had 2 years before they had to pack up and leave for Minnesota. And so 2 years comes around, and Oshkosh is telling the government, well, can we get a postponement for 1 year? Just one more year, because we're not ready. We're taking in harvests and doing this and doing that. And he did that 2 years in a row. So now this treaty's been signed for 4 years, and they still haven't moved. So then a delegation of Menominee chiefs went to Minnesota and saw the land that they were supposed to get. And they were less than impressed, to say the least. Another problem is that they would have been sandwiched right between the Sioux reservation and the Chippewa reservation. And the Sioux and the Chippewa were constantly at war with each other. Okay. And here they are right smack dab in the middle. And that was not very appealing also. So when they returned, that's when they began talking through their interpreters and the Indian agent and decided to petition Washington. And so there you see, Chief Oshkosh coming again gives this long speech about how the Menominee love this land, how they have always lived here. It's the home of their heritage, and that they have always supported the American government. And President Fillmore was very touched and was very impressed. And General Winfield Scott was present during those, and he made the comment that he said he had never heard such an impassioned speech ever spoken by white or native.
So obviously the Menominee didn't have to move then.
Yes.
What was that the president signing off on it, or was it some type of act of Congress to alleviate them from that responsibility?
No, the president had all authority, the head authority for making these treaties. So this is not something that would have gone through Congress at all. And it was a leftover from President Andrew Jackson, who wanted to remove all native tribes out of the east over the Mississippi River. And this is just a continuation of that policy. So Chief Oshkosh was able to, by hook or by crook, get the tribe to stay right here.
Well, so it sounds like if he was a politician, he's a pretty good one at that.
Very good one. Yeah. And the odds were often against him, but he knew how to play it very well, I think.
Okay. Before we get to the picture, Scott, just one thing, artifacts. We were talking a little bit about artifacts. What does the museum have, and are there any items right now that are visible? I mean, where the public can come in and check them, just look at them, or would you have anything in the archives where they're not visible?
We don't have any original archival materials related to Chief Oshkosh, but we do have quite a few artifacts. Probably, we did have them on exhibit during the sesquicentennial, but we rotate our exhibits all the time. So right now, none of those are on exhibit. But probably the most eye-catching thing is Chief Oshkosh's top hat.
Yeah.
So, how many of them he had, we don't know, but according to the donor, the hat was given to their family by Chief Oshkosh, and so that's pretty significant.
What is that made out of, and how do you keep something like that through the years? It's got to be impossible.
Well, it's basically a cardboard frame with a cardboard tube and a cardboard brim. And what a hat maker at that time would do would take fine beaver felt, or just the hairs itself, and glue and attach those, and comb those, and you get your beaver hats that way. And then they would have been decorated around the crown with a silk ribbon or silk binding around the edges, and then a leather sweatband, and then you'd have sometimes a cotton lining on the inside. So you've got all these different materials, which makes it a bit of a challenge, especially silk, because silk deteriorates.
What kind of shape is it in?
It's in very good shape. It's
Really?
very displayable. Yes.
When do you think that may be out for public view next? Any idea?
I'm not involved with the exhibits of artifacts, so I really couldn't say.
Okay. How often does it come out where people can see it? Do you remember that?
In the 14 years that I've worked here, it's just come out that one time, and that was during the sesquicentennial.
Okay, all right. Well, Derek and I had a bunch of questions. This is your book again, folks. This is Like a Deer Chased by the Dogs, The Life of Chief Oshkosh. This is available at the Oshkosh Public Museum. You can pick that up. Very inexpensive. What is it, like?
It's less than $5.
Yeah, it's less than $5. So I'm going to, for the show, I went and got the one at the museum, but I'm gonna go down and get one from you. Maybe I can get this one from you tonight. So go down and get that. Is there anything in the book that Derek and I didn't touch on that you think is important, or maybe a misnomer from people that you hear in Oshkosh that this is not true? I want to clear the record. Anything that you can think of? The alcoholism. I mean, that legend is pretty much a fact, huh?
Right. Yeah. From all written accounts, it's usually mentioned that he was, if not a heavy drinker, but he was would get into a bad mood and drink to excess at times. And it's somewhat ironic, though, too, because Oshkosh himself, when he spoke to the tribe, was very anti-liquor. I mentioned earlier that they would have annuity payments, and the area for that payment was on Lake Poygan. And that was the pay grounds is what it was actually called, where everybody in the tribe would come down, be identified, make their mark on the ledger, and then they would be paid cash, which would have been coins at that time, since paper money didn't exist. And traders would come in selling goods, but with the traders would also come the whiskey sellers. And at times, there was one incident where the alcohol was flowing so freely that a murder occurred, And the members who witnessed it were so incensed. There was a large bonfire there. They took the killer and actually threw him into the fire.
Really?
And a witness, not to that incident, but to a speech about a year later, was Chief Oshkosh telling the story of how this happened and begging, the Indian agent to keep these whiskey sellers out of the camp and when the payment is going on. And he said, I know they're not here now, but I can tell you they're right over here across the river, just waiting for, people to come over there and start buying this stuff. And he gave quite a speech, against the uses of liquor and how it could destroy their tribe. And so he was a bit of a mixture.
Okay. All right. Well, as I stated, you were nice enough to send along some pictures.
Yes.
Some various pictures. So, guys, if you can pull up the pictures, and we'll look at those on the screen. And, Scott, as they come up, if you just want to comment on first one. Well, that's not my picture. Okay, there we go. That's first picture. So why don't we talk about this a bit?
Sure. This is an original daguerreotype of Chief Oshkosh that is in the collection of the Oshkosh Public Museum. This was donated to us back in the 1920s by a descendant of the Whitney family. The Whitney family were early pioneers in Green Bay and Brown County. And the story is that the donor's ancestor was a good friend with Chief Oshkosh, which is probably true since he was in the fur trade business and worked with the tribe and also was an interpreter and spoke the language quite well. Well, on a visit to Green Bay to visit with Mr. Whitney, Mr. Whitney was able to persuade him to go down to a photographer's studio and have his image taken. When they arrived at the studio, Chief Oshkosh felt a little awkward and was a little bit afraid of this process. And so Mr. Whitney sat down, the photographer made an image of him, they showed it to Chief Oshkosh. Chief Oshkosh was just amazed, because here's this little mirror with his friend's face on it.
Yeah.
And so he gladly sat down.
Yeah.
And the story passed down through the family is that he liked it so much he sat for another one.
Okay.
So this one stayed with the Whitney family, and it's presumed that the other daguerreotype Chief Oshkosh took home himself.
And so, to the best of your knowledge, this is the only remaining daguerreotype, that you know of anyway.
It's the only surviving one. There probably was another one. I don't know if you can bring up the engraving. There we go. Joseph Osborne published a book on the history of Winnebago County in 1856 when Chief Oshkosh was still alive. And if you've ever seen a copy of this, because somebody had photocopied them, there are still a few original copies of this book floating around. But this engraving comes from that book. And he mentions, you probably can't see it, but it says, based on a daguerreotype by J.H. Harrison. J.H. Harrison was a photographer here in Oshkosh in the 1850s. He was commissioned by Joseph Osborne, who was a pioneer settler of Oshkosh, and whose log cabin is the oldest structure in Oshkosh still standing. But he commissioned this portrait and also one of Webster Stanley. Besides the two portraits that appear in the book, there are several other images taken around Oshkosh. Two daguerreotypes were taken of what was then the float bridge before a permanent bridge was built on what's Main Street, then Ferry Street. There was a daguerreotype taken of the unincorporated village of Algoma, one of Neenah, one of Winneconne, and several other areas. What Osborne then did was he sent those daguerreotypes to an engraver in New York City. And what you see here is what was produced then and went into the book. Well, many years later, Osborne donated those original engravings from his book to the Wisconsin Historical Society. And a few years after that, it's recorded in their annual donations that Osborne donated a collection of daguerreotypes of the Oshkosh area. So I contacted the Wisconsin Historical Society archives because I knew two of those daguerreotypes still existed. I was able to obtain prints of those. And they're two different views of the float bridge over the Fox River. So I showed them the accession records from 1888, and I asked, so could you tell me where all the other daguerreotypes are? And the staff there had no records of them. They don't know where they were.
Oh boy.
So another daguerreotype did exist at one time, but unfortunately today, it's not known where it is.
Okay. Guys, if we can go to the next slide picture. Okay, what do we have here?
Well, I mentioned that in 1926, after they brought what may or may not be the body of Chief Oshkosh to the city, they had a very large parade. This is a flatbed truck. It's decorated with flowers, and it's almost impossible to see because there's so many decorations there. But right in the middle is the casket containing the body of Chief Oshkosh.
Is this in front of the Buckstaff Company?
Yes,
Okay.
yes it is. The parade started on South Main Street, went across the bridge, up onto North Main Street, and then went to Menominee Park.
Okay, guys, next slide.
And here you see the graveside services. The casket is ready to be lowered into the ground. Members of the Menominee tribe are in attendance, including two descendants, his grandsons, Ernest Oshkosh and Reginald Oshkosh. And I believe that is Reginald wearing the full headdress, but unfortunately with his back turned to the camera.
You mentioned before about a casket in a casket. Is that in play here or not?
That was in the original burial.
Oh, the original. Okay,
Yes.
this is it, right. Okay.
Yeah, there's not a real detailed account in the newspaper as to the specifics of
And
this one.
what year again did this take place?
1926.
1926. And how do you remember any records of how many people attended this event here in the park?
No, but from everything I read, it just says the attendance was just massive.
Unbelievable.
Yes, the park was just filled with people who wanted to attend.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Next slide.
Once again, this is just as they were ready to lower the casket into the ground, and I recognize that as definitely Reginald Oshkosh standing there. The other may be his brother Ernest in the background. I'm sorry, cousin. They weren't brothers.
Okay. I believe we have one more slide.
And that's pretty much what it looks like today. A statue had already been erected in Menominee Park. I forgot which year, but I know it was the Hicks family that owned the Oshkosh Northwestern that had this commissioned by an Italian sculptor. Looking at it and looking at the images of Chief Oshkosh, you can see that really doesn't resemble Chief Oshkosh. It's more of an idyllic Native American in general, standing proud and strong. And his body was then buried right in front of where that statue is.
I was also told that in the commission of that statue, that the Hicks did want that in Menominee Park. They wanted him to be next to Lake Winnebago and looking out over Lake Winnebago. Is that factual?
That's probably very true. It was also at that time that they changed the name of the park. It had originally been called North Park.
Okay.
So you had two parks, North Park, South Park. Part of the deal with Hicks was, though, he said that he would present this, statue to the community on the condition that they would change the name of the park from North Park to Menominee Park.
Okay, and what year would have that taken place?
Right off the top of my head, I don't recall what year that was, but it would have been in the teens or 20s, early 20s, because Hicks would have still been alive at that time.
Okay. Going kind of back to the artifacts, I know as a person that's collected brewery stuff for 35 years now, I guess, hard for me to say that, something always comes up on a rare occasion that comes up from someone you've never heard from, or it was in a basement, it was in an attic, whatever, some brewery item that no one has ever seen before. Do you hold out any hope that there's something that's out there that is in a basement or someone has?
That's always that possibility. I never rule that out because things come into a museum that may have been sitting in an attic for 100 years or if sometimes longer, And it never ceases to amaze me, the things that come to our museum. It could be something, that's been lost to human eyes for many, many years, just now seeing the light of day. So it's possible that something. The problem is that as time goes by, the folklore or tradition about this being associated with a certain person can get lost very easily.
Right.
So even if somebody stumbles upon something, unless there's a note written on it or something of that nature, you would never know that
Right.
it even belonged to Chief Oshkosh.
Well, and I think unfortunately, the other thing that you have going on is if it is in an attic or a crawl space or something, the climate conditions are atrocious.
Yes.
And I don't know if I asked you, the hat that you have, how do you keep that where it doesn't decay?
Well, we keep, with all of our textiles and other artifacts in the collection, we pay very particular attention to them. The hat, for instance, would be stuffed with an acid-free tissue to give it support from the inside. It then would be placed in an acid-free box, like a hat box, what would be specially constructed for it. Would then be stored on shelves that would not rust, that have enamel, coatings on them. And then the environment in that area is very, very crucial. We have to keep the temperature at a steady, cool temperature. The humidity levels have to be at a certain levels, because if you got too much humidity in a room, you're running the risk of having mold, mildew.
Yeah, right.
And if you've ever pulled anything out of a basement where it's really humid, it can really destroy things. And
Right.
I have things that come out of people's basement and come into the archives, and sometimes they're just too far gone. And you don't want it too dry, on the other hand, too.
It's brittle.
It's brittle, and once it gets brittle, it's easily broken and damaged, so we're very careful about those things.
Okay, well, Scott, unfortunately, we're down to like 2 minutes. I just want you to speculate, if you could. If Chief Oshkosh could see Oshkosh today, or if he were around and took a trip around the city, what do you think he'd say?
I think you would be totally amazed, absolutely totally amazed, to see how much the city had grown. His last visit was probably around 1855, just before his death. And if you look at a map of Oshkosh from 1860, just how small it was and just how large it is today.
Well, and the other thing is, as we all know, the city of Oshkosh is known not only in the United States, but it's known worldwide.
Very much.
In great part to the Experimental Aircraft Association, Oshkosh Truck, and the other great, companies that we have here. So, well, Scott, you know what? This is great. Thank you very much. On behalf
pleasure.
of Derek and myself, we want to thank you for showing up today. Again, like a deer chased by the dogs, the life of Chief Oshkosh, Scott Cross. If you have any questions of Scott, I'm sure he'd be more than happy to answer your questions. Otherwise, go down and get the book. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have here today. So hope you can join us next time for Oshkosh Diaries. Thanks for watching.